all ethical judgments, I think really shows us the way in which objectivity resides in ethics, which is that when we say something is right or wrong, we're sort of summarizing or referring to what is ultimately something of the form of, if a person values a certain goal, then they ought to do a certain kind of behavior or action to the extent that the action leads to the goal. So this is the way in which objectivity can arise in ethics. There's three ways in which, so I mean really the problem is, how does one say to another person, you're wrong about your ethical judgment that, you know, stealing my newspaper is okay? How does one go about saying that? There's really three ways. The first is to notice that the behavior you're advocating doesn't actually lead to the goal that you're saying that you value. I mean, an example that I've chosen, maybe controversial in this context, is that prayer heals people. So, I mean, empirically, we don't see any evidence of this. So it seems wrong somehow to suggest that that prayer would be imperative. Another way that we could be wrong about our ethical conclusions is to notice that the goal that we have in mind contradicts other subjectively held goals that we have. Like, for example, again, another controversial example, maybe not a helpful one, but another example other than the one I've chosen is to say something about, for example, slavery. The reason why North America and England and the world was able to move on from the history of slavery was to notice the way in which our preference for slavery was in tension, in contradiction to our other deeply held values. And the last way in which our ethical beliefs can be wrong is to notice that the it should be not why, but the value, the goal that we have, contradicts another goal that we ought to have on reflection. So, I mean, for example, it's basically here we see the relevance of the imperative to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Through reflecting on that intuitive principle, we can realize imperatives that we would otherwise have not seen. By the way, how much time do I have? I can't remember when I started.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay, that's fine. So consent arises through deliberation. I think is a fair way of observing the way in which human beings navigate the moral landscape. And we could imagine, I think Dr. Rana is onto something in describing God as sort of the ideal of human relations, the image of God. And we could imagine an analogous sort of situation among human beings that doesn't rely on a supernatural deity by conceiving of a hypothetical society that was fully rational, let's say. So that would mean that they wouldn't be contradicting themselves in their judgments, and fully knowledgeable, so that they knew what sorts of behavior would lead to what sorts of goals. In such a society, there wouldn't be any disagreement about what we ought to do, because everybody would know what sorts of behavior would lead to what sorts of ends. And yeah, unfortunately, we aren't in such a society. But the point is that the idea of an objective truth about morality is given meaning through imagining such a hypothetical society, even if epistemically we're not able to access that, or it's difficult for us to. And so yeah, that's basically my presentation, is to say that, just to recap, to say that God doesn't provide an objective basis to morality. And so we have to find one together, both theists and non-theists. And I think that rationality and having a conversation together about our mutual interests is really the way to go about doing that. Because otherwise, we really have no objective basis. Thank you.
Do you need the PowerPoint? So we'll have 10-minute rebuttal now from Dr. Rana. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that that was an excellent presentation. Very well thought out, and I think very cogent and very reasonable. So there may not be a whole lot to rebut in many respects, because I found very little to disagree with in terms of what you're saying, which perhaps is a really good thing. I'd like to go to the idea that was mentioned very briefly at the beginning, and that is that non-believers can be good. And I am in full agreement with that idea that a person can be a non-believer and be good. In fact, there are many instances to, I think, the embarrassment of the church where non-believers actually outperform believers in terms of their behavior. And again, that's to the shame of the church. But I believe that the reason for that is because, again, both the believer and the non-believer are made in God's image and have an intrinsic understanding of right and wrong, going back to Mark Hauser's arguments that there's a moral organ. And so that's why I believe both believers and non-believers recognize, again, what is good behavior, what's behavior that's not acceptable, and why they pursue, at least or desire in many instances, to pursue that which we would consider to be good behavior. And with respect to the idea of God as a lawgiver, I think I would object mildly to the idea that when God is functioning as this lawgiver, I believe that morality would emanate from God himself. So I think I would be aligned to some degree with William Lane Craig on that, that the law that God, from a Christian perspective, that God provides to us, again, emanates from his very character, his very nature. But I don't believe that the laws that are being prescribed, again, are arbitrary just because God commands them, or something is impermissible because God forbids it. But rather, I believe that, again, it stems from the idea that human beings are made in God's image and have intrinsic value and worth, and that the behaviors that we are to aspire to, that we're commanded to, again, from a Christian perspective, are behaviors that respect human beings because, again, they are made in God's image. That's why you don't murder a human being, because they're made in God's image. That's why you don't steal from a human being, because you're robbing them of the fruit of their labor. And the reason why that's, again, unacceptable is because they're made in God's image. You don't lie to another human being because that shows disrespect to that person, again, who's made in God's image. So I believe that, again, from a Christian perspective, I don't think the view would be that the law is arbitrary, but rather is deeply rooted in the idea that human beings are made in God's image. And this idea, too, that you can arrive at a moral code that's objective through rational deliberation, again, I am comfortable with that idea and think that that is not necessarily incompatible with a Christian worldview, which basically would argue that if indeed there's an objective morality that is emanating from God, who is the creator of the world that we live in, who's made human beings in God's image, that again we should be able, through deliberation, because rational deliberation is part of God's image, that we should be able to discover principles that again are objectively true when it comes to morality. And it's interesting that one point, as I think I understood you to say, is that the basis for using rational decision-making to arrive at, again, moral principles is to avoid human suffering, or to try to minimize the amount of human suffering, which, again, I am in full agreement with. But that, I think, implies, again, an intrinsic value to human beings that I'm not completely convinced you could necessarily defend if you argue that God does not exist. Because if human beings are a product of an undirected evolutionary process that is part of the operation of a universe that has no purpose, that's just a brute reality, there's no intrinsic value necessarily to human beings. And so therefore, what is the basis or the grounding for saying that minimizing human suffering is good? So it seems to me that you do have to have something there that grounds that starting point before you can build, again, an objective morality from rational decision making. I think that would be my response to the presentation, which again I thought to be a very good presentation, and there was a lot there that I would agree with. And in fact, I was almost struggling to come up with some things to offer the rebuttal. So.
I hope the disagreements come to question and answer. We'll have a 10-minute rebuttal from Magda.